So from now on, I'm going to just have like a bunch of slides regarding different features of JavaScript, okay? And I want to discuss some details because these things keep changing. Honestly, JavaScript is a fairly uh, like in dynamic language in the sense of development too. So it has been changing a lot throughout these years. It's a much more powerful language nowadays. But because of that, there's a lot of discussion of different ways of writing the same thing because they keep like features from the past, and these features they take some time to die. And then for a lot of, for example, nowadays we have this lat keyword, we also have the var keyword. They kind of do the same thing, but they're different. So this kind of stuff happens a lot in JavaScript, which can, like as I said, can get kind of messy. That's why it's important to discuss them. So basically in JavaScript, you can create variables with lat and var. And here I have an example of like a of of why you would use lat as opposed to var. Basically, lat is the most restrictive way of creating a variable. And this means that, for example, if you create a variable with var, that variable is in the scope of the function that you wrote that variable. So, and the lat is only valid in the scope, or actually in the lowest scope that you wrote. And a scope can be defined by if statements, a scope can be defined by for loops, a scope can be defined by functions. But if you write var x equals 1, that variable x now is defined for the whole function, if that is inside a function. But in the case of the lat equals x equals 2, sorry, that x is only valid in the scope of the if. So as you see here in this example, right, if x equals 1 is true, because I just defined var x equals 1 here. And you know what? Let me write this. I think I'm going to write this. I'm going to do some. Let's run this thing. I'm going to open the console here. Let me organize this window. Okay, so here, let me clear this thing. Okay, so what I want to do is I want to say var x equals 1. And then I say if x equals 1, I'm going to say let x equals 2, and then console.log x. I want to close this now. See, like when we write this, at this point here, we get x equals 1, and then we test, is x equals 1? Yes, it is. So he enters the if, and then we say, now we are doing let x equals 2. So you are technically overriding x. But this x here, it's only valid, it's only a variable inside the if. So if I print now is equals 2, but if I print it again, I'm not changing x at all, but if I print x, I get 1, because this x here comes from the var x. So the lesson here is that lat is a very restrictive way of defining a variable, that it's only valid in the certain in that scope that you created a variable. You might see this when you're dealing with your own variables. You might see cases where using var is better than using lat. But as a rule of thumb, I always use lat because it's the most restrictive. And normally in programming, when you're programming, it's good to protect your variables as much as possible. Okay, let's move forward. I'm going to keep the console here so we can actually run other examples, right? So data types in JavaScript. Data types are implicit. And so you don't have to type integer, or when you're declaring a variable, you don't type int or char or string or whatever. These are implicit. And but there are 7 data types in JavaScript: number, string, boolean, object, null, undefined, and symbol. Um, and number can be an integer, can be a float, and so there's no big difference between these two types of numbers. String is a string. There's no idea of character. So if you have a string, if just one character, it's still a string. Booleans can be true or false. Objects are objects in the sense of Java and this object-oriented um, languages. It's funny that null and undefined and symbol, they are their own types. They have their own types. And more specifically, it's kind of weird that null and undefined coexist, and they are also two different types. This is a kind of a long discussion. I don't want to discuss much about the difference between null and undefined. So, but basically, undefined is when you, for example, when you create a variable and you don't put any values in it, you get undefined. And null is more like when you return something that is invalid or something like that. So meaningful, there is some different meanings and they have different implications, but most of the time I just kind of think about both of them as the same thing. Let's see if there's any interesting example here. I don't think there is any. Oh yeah, let me talk a little bit about the objects. Objects in JavaScript are very similar to dictionaries in Python. So for example, I can create an object user like this and say name. Say like I'm giving an attribute name to the object user and saying name Anna. Right. Now I can say if I just type user here, actually if I print console.log user, I can see that the object has an attribute name in it. But so JavaScript is dynamic, so I could keep going and saying user dot, let's say, age equals 21. And now if I console.log, I have name and age inside that object. I could keep going and saying name, not name, user dot, let's say location equals to the string UCSC and so on, okay? Instead of doing that, I want to show another notation, which is like a dictionary-like notation from Python. You can actually do the same thing by saying this. You can square brackets and then string location equals to UCSC. This has the same effect. So if I print user, now you see that location is also there as part of the attribute, as an attribute of the object, but we just use this dictionary notation. But this is just an alias for the dot notation. So you can create objects like this in a very dynamic way, keep adding elements to it. Different than other languages where you normally need a constructor for the class, where only the things in the constructor are created. In this case, you can add many things. In JavaScript, also you can have a constructor and the class type of structure, and we're going to talk about it later. But this is a dynamic way of making objects. Okay, let's me move forward. So JavaScript already has the arrays for you, so you don't have to worry about them. And arrays are also very diverse. You can use arrays to implement different types of linear data structures, arrays, lists, like linked lists, stacks, in even priority lists and so on. So arrays are very, very powerful data structures in JavaScript. For example, let's create one here. I'm going to clear this console. Let's say let L1 equals to, oh, now it's an empty array. So if I print this, it's empty, but we can do L1 dot push 1, for example. And if I push 2, I have now the following list. Right, I have one L1. I have now 1 and 2. So push works as like a stack type of push, right? I'm pushing always on top of the list. Append and pop also removes the last element of the list, but I can also do append to append an element to a list. 5, for example. Oh, sorry. No, not append. My bad. Append is in Python. It's push and pop. Yeah, that's it. I just got confused now. But you can. Oh, something that is cool about lists arrays is that actually, again, let me print the list again. You can mix and match types of types in a list. So I can do, for example, push. I can push a string to it. Let's say string error. And now my list has numbers and strings in it. So, and you can have objects and null and Boolean values and anything. So a list is a container for any type of data type. So this, again, this is very useful, but it can be kind of messy as well. So because if you're iterating on a list, and you have to make sure that you are always iterating in a list of integers if you are doing integer operations, right, and so on. So this can happen. Sometimes you have unexpected types in your list, and you get an error because you were expecting an integer, but it turns out there is a string in there or a Boolean. But this can be very, very helpful. Arrays, again, they have many methods already implemented for you. So if you want to slice arrays, and most of the common operations are already there. So just look it up in the documentation to if you're interested on, or if you need to do any operation with arrays. And you will for sure. Okay, what time? Let me see. What time is it now? It's 11:40. Do you have any questions so far? Okay, no. I'm gonna move forward. Arrays. Okay, IO. So we already talked about console.log. I'm not gonna like kind of. There's nothing to talk about that like here. But there is some cool stuff you can do. You can have pop-up windows or in your web page by having just the function, calling the function alert. So for example, if I call alert, it's 11:40. See, I get a pop-up here with the message. Yeah, with the message 11:40. Okay. And then I press OK. So this is just a warning message. You can press OK, and that's it. If you want to do, you can also do prompt. For example, same thing, it's 11:40. And now, so for example, so actually, let me show you can do, it's 11:40. What do you want to do? I don't know. What do you want to do? And here you can actually get the return of this prompt. So if I say, for example, answer. So for now I can say, what do you want to do? I don't know, talk about, keep talking about JavaScript, JS. If I press OK, now I can console.log answer, and I get the string keep talking about JavaScript. Right? That's what I typed. And confirm works similarly. You have a message. I'm going to just type message. I'm gonna say, do you like this lab? And say, okay. Right. And similarly, you also have an answer here. And if I do, now I get this type of pop-up where I have a cancel and an okay. So I can say okay, and then if I console.log, I get true. If you press cancel, you get false. And I believe that you can customize the buttons by giving two extra arguments here. I think no and yes, I believe. Let me see. No. Yeah, I think that I know there's a way of customizing this, but it's not in the function. But still, like it works like this. Okay, that's it about I/O. This is like the default ways of doing I/O in JavaScript. There is, if you want to ask questions to the user like that, of course you can implement your own type of interaction with the user. This is just a very simple default way that you can use. Let's talk about operators in JavaScript. You have unary and binary, and I think, yeah, and there's ternary operators as well. But so unary operators are operators that require only one variable. And in the most common ones in JavaScript is the assignment. So when you say then the variable, when you declare a variable and say equals, that equal sign is an operator. And that pretty much saves the value into a variable, right? It's kind of obvious, but yeah, I'm just highlighting that's an operator. You have the negation operator, where we can do minus that variable, and then you negate that. You're going to get the inverse of that number. You have the conversion, which, and this is one is kind of interesting because it's not very intuitive. So for example, if I do a variable, if I do plus true is going to do a conversion. Oh, it has already been declared. So if I say let O equals plus true. Now if I print O is 1. And if I do plus false, now it's 0. So this is another very common operator. You don't see this very much, in implementations. You don't see this very much on the web or anything like that, but it's there. It's an operator that it's there in JavaScript. And you have increment, decrement type of things, plus, plus, minus, minus, and these are just similar to C, right? You have let I equals 0, and you can say I plus plus, and now your I, as expected, should be 1. Okay. So and if you can have minus minus, and the difference between doing it after or before the variable is that if you are in a for loop context, the plus plus after is going to be executed after the for loop, or if you do the plus plus before, it's going to be executed like right away. So I normally just use the after version of both plus plus and minus minus, but there are some cases it might be useful to use the version that you put before the variable. Okay. Let's move on now to the binary operators. As usual, you have all the plus, minus, multiplication, division. You have the modulo operation and the exponentiation. So you don't need some functions like C. You need to import the C standard library to get some functions like square root or exponentiation or stuff like that. Here you don't need to. Like here you can just type 2 times 4, you get you get 2/4. You can do, yeah, you can do square root. Oh no, you are here actually in JavaScript. I don't think it's here, but in JavaScript also I'm going to mention, since I'm talking about math operations, you have this math object that gives you a bunch of functions already. So if you want to do like trig type of functions like cosine, sine, and all of that, you get all of them here. You have logarithm, you have mean, max, random. You have a bunch of mathematical operations here. I believe those are the same that you normally find in the C standard math library, but I'm sure you find all of them, but there might be more. But yeah, so this is a very useful object that already gives you a lot of extra mathematical operations. So if you want to do log, for example, 0, it even gives you minus infinity, but log of 1, you're going to get 1, and so on. So log of 2, and this is the natural log. And so let's say, okay, this isn't not very interesting. Let's move on. Yeah, conditionals, you can do if else. Again, nothing much to talk about here. Just like highlighting what type of, like if you want to type else. If you want to do nested structures, you use else if, and if separated, similar to C. Else and if are different statements that you can combine if you just if you type it like the if after the else without any curly brackets. But yeah, this is just how you would write a nested if structure in JavaScript. We have a switch statement, which I find useful. And I think my Python doesn't have a switch statement, but JavaScript has. And this you can switch. You can do the switch in any type you want, including strings, for example, and integers. So you can say switch fruit, and if in the case of orange, then you have you can run whatever you want in there. You can type. You can have any functionality you want. Let me just keep track of time. 11:50. Yeah, for loops, you have the for loops, which I mean they work as expected. They have different syntaxes. For example, you can say this is the C-like syntax, right? The first one here, you have for let I equals 0, I less than 10, I plus plus, and then you can have the control of the I index. You can also, so I want to actually talk about these two other options here, and because this is different in JavaScript. If you have, let's say, a list of items, and I'm going to copy from the slide 3, 4, 5. Right. Let me first, just for the sake of the argument, I'm going to say for let I equals 0, right? I less than, in this case, I know the length, but you can say items dot length. I plus plus, okay? That's the kind of the traditional way of typing this. So you're going to say console.log items index items of I, and then I'm going to print this. I get 3, 4, 5, right? If I print items, if I print I get 0, 1, 1, 2, right? Oh, this is expected. You have shortcuts for these for loops. If you want to iterate on the indices, you can say for I in items. If you use in, you're iterating on the indices. So you get 0, 1, 2. But note that the items values are 3, 4, 5. So if I want to iterate on the values, I need to use the operator off. So if I use off, now I get 3, 4, 5, because these are the actual values. So 3 is the value in the index 0, 4 is the value in the index 1, and 5 is the value in the index 2. So there is these two ways of iterating on a list in JavaScript. And this is useful. It can be confusing sometimes, but yeah, just keep in mind you have these two possibilities. Any questions about this? I don't think so. Okay. I keep losing my chat. Okay, no questions. Let's move on. We have 7 minutes. We also have while loops for making repetitive statements, so or to repeat statements. So we can do while I like for example less than 10. If you have a I defined before, you have also the do while loop. This is less common, but it might be useful sometimes. So do while, you run the condition after the statements, and the traditional while loop, the condition to check if you enter the loop, you're going to run before every iteration, right? I mean, nothing really new to talk here as well. Oh, so yeah, functions are can be very different in JavaScript, but essentially when you're defining a function, as I said, you can, and I want to move to the source code here because I think it's better to type it here. A function, as I said, you can create a function, I can call this whatever I want. Let's say function test1. And here I can say no arguments. I can also do this test2, and then have one argument here, right? I can have argument 2 and argument 1 and argument 2 and many as I, okay, I already talked about this. But what is cool is that I can also do something like this. I can define a function. Let's say like I can say let x equals function, and then I can say, for example, or let add equals function. Then I can here, and I don't give any name to this function, and I say xy, and here I do return x plus y. Return, oh, okay, I close it. Here should be a close bracket. Oh, it's already been declared, so I have to use, let's say, add vars, I don't know. So now add vars is a function that I created with this different notation. I created a variable that is a function. So if I can retype this here, like let add equals a function x and y, and this function doesn't have a name per se, like when you define it, but the variable stores the function anyway. So you can say plus x and y, and this works as well. Or you could have something like this. You can define the function and then later assign it to a variable. And remember our object, we had an object called user, right? If you want to add a method to an object, you can say user dot add, or for example, imagine like user dot, maybe you can have a function. Yeah, add is not a good, but what could be a good function for a user? Maybe maybe get full name, right? Get full name. And you can say this is a function, and this returns, oh, wait, this returns maybe like user dot name plus user dot last name, for example. We don't have last name. You don't have last name, but this is going to actually work. I mean, we can create this. We can create this function. It doesn't. JavaScript doesn't give us an error yet because we haven't called that function. But we define that function. Get full name is here now as a function. We have name, but now let's make user last name equals to, I don't know, Anna Smith. And then now if I call user dot get full name, I get Anna Smith, right? So now I'm see how I'm building this object in a very dynamic way. One like adding attributes and functions as I go. This is very possible in JavaScript. That's not normally how you're going to do it, and we're going to do classes and so on. Unfortunately, let's see. I'm going to try to move a bit faster. There's other examples of functions here. So I want you to maybe like go ahead and take a look at the slides later, but this is just some other extra examples. Accessing the DOM, we already talked about it. We already talked about get the element by ID function in our first example. Just another slide here showing different examples. You can get the elements by tag name as well. So in this case, PL elements here is a list of all the elements with the tag P. So the elements is an array, actually. Sorry, so not a list, it's an array. So you could iterate on all the P or all the paragraphs of the website, for instance. The same you could do for images. If you want to return all the images or retrieve all the images in the website, you could use get elements by tag name. But basically, these are the two main ways of retrieving from the DOM. Asynchronous calls. Yeah, this is like this gets more like on the networking side of JavaScript. For example, if you want to run a HTTP request from JavaScript, you could write this, but we're gonna use this at some point in our assignments, and we're gonna have to run an HTTP request at some point in our future assignments, not this one. And I'm gonna come back to this later. I don't think it's a good time. There's a lot of information, and we are actually already like on time. So I'm gonna skip this for now. And this slide is basically kind of like a hint or a tip of how libraries work in JavaScript. Libraries are normally organized as a big object. For example, the math library, right? The math library it's pretty much is a huge object that has a bunch of functions. And normally that's how libraries are delivered or imported in JavaScript. You create a file, and then this file has a function that creates this object with many attributes and functions. And that's what a library mainly is in JavaScript. So for example, you could say var library equals new library, and then library, you can start calling functions there. Okay, I'm gonna go a little bit over time because I wanna talk about classes. I want to talk about actual classes in JavaScript because this is a very useful way of creating objects in an organized way. So so far we've created these objects in a very kind of ad hoc format, but I want to give you this notation of making classes that is very similar to what you're used to in Java if you know Java or C++. And I think we even kind of encourage you in the first assignment to follow this structure. So that's why I wanna talk about this. And I promise I'll be quick. So we've been working with this idea. Oh, sorry, let me keep this file here. I'm gonna actually erase this, guys. Actually, I'm gonna keep this here just for reference. But I'm gonna create a file. I'm gonna call this user.js. Okay. So in Java or these common languages, you would have normally one file per class, right? So, and if you want to do that in JavaScript, you can. And you would do it this way. You're going to have a class. Normally, your class has a capital, starts with a capital letter. And then the constructor of the class is a function with the name constructor. So this is similar to init or underscore init in Python. And in C++, you would have the method that is the name of the class as a constructor and so on. So this is like when you call the operator new, this function gets called. So for example, here we're going to have our variables. Let's initialize our variables. So for example, let's imagine you're creating a user with some age, name, and last name. Okay. So inside the class, you have this um, object, this, that stores the reference of the object you're creating. So I can say this.age equals age, this.name equals name, right? And this.last name equals last name, right? So now I'm gonna save this. We have to import this file in our HTML. So I'm gonna copy this line. I'm gonna say JS. This is user.js, okay? So now in our, and just for, because that's to keep the order correctly, I'm gonna load user before main. So it's normally good to keep your main at the bottom because you wanna make sure that you have everything before you start your main. So here now, we should be able to create a user. And here we can say let user equals to new user, and we can say age 21, name Anna, and last name Smith, right? So if I console.log this user object, now let's see what we get. We get the same object we've been creating there, we get it this way. But now this is a way more organized way. Because now we can have this kind of factory method, like we can create many different objects of the same class. And if you want to have a function here, so in class, we don't need to type function if you want to make a method. You just type the function, like the function name right away. So you can say directly. So you can say, for example, get full name. And this return this dot name plus works also for concatenating strings. So if you want to say this dot name, you add an empty space and then this last name. And this is how you would have a class. For example, now we can call console.user.get last name here. And this way we can make, wait, get last name is not a function. Did we make something wrong? User, oh, get full name, right? Get full name. Okay. There you go. So this is the basics of creating a class. You have all the functionalities that you have in normal object-oriented languages. So for example, obviously you can inherit other classes by saying, for example, you can say class, let's say if it's a user, we can say class student, right? Student extends user. So if you use the keyword extends, now student inherits all the methods and attributes from user. You have static, you can have static functions and variables. For example, you can have static, maybe school could be static in this case because everyone is going to be UCSC. You can have static functions if you want, and so all the major functionalities from Java you can expect in JavaScript. And this is useful for the first assignment and is useful moving forward because we encourage you to use this kind of class organization in your assignments. Yeah, I don't want to extend myself too long now. So let me just go and finish up the slides and I'll take the last questions and we are good to go. Yeah, as I said, there's inheritance here and that's it. Yeah, good. So here there's two links that are very useful if you are not very familiar with JavaScript or if you want to just maybe brush up on your JavaScript or learn some extra stuff. I really like this book called Eloquent JavaScript. It's very modern and well illustrated, really good examples, very easy to read. You can read from chapters 1 to 6. That's going to cover most of what you need. Remember, this is not a mandatory reading. There's no questions about this on the homeworks. It's just for your own reference.